iTunes Radio now works in Oz, but should you tune in?
And Fetch TV, is it the one PVR and pay TV box to rule them all? Welcome to Vertical Hold, the tech show where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm here with colourful racing identity Alex Kidman. Alex,
Hey!
what's been happening in tech news?
Now you flap it, now you don't. Virally popular game, although I use the term game here pretty darned loosely, Flappy Bird has been pulled from the Google and Apple app stores after its developer stated that it was ruining his life. Ruining his life reportedly to the tune of 50 grand a day, and with that kind of money in play, it's not surprising that there are now more Flappy Bird clones than you can shake a wing at.
Sony has abandoned its North American ebook stores, directing its customers towards Kobo. Sony Australia says it has no plans at this point to close the local bookstore, although Sony here does face stiff competition from both Kobo and Amazon's Kindle.
Having spent last episode resoundingly trashing the things, it appears that the humble robot vacuum cleaner might be in for a bit of a redesign. James Dyson has announced that he's investing £5 million in a robotics lab at a London university, with the aim being to design better household robots. Dyson is of course famous for his cyclonic vacuum cleaner, so it's quite feasible that in the near future we might have a robot vacuum cleaner that both does and doesn't suck.
The rumour mill says that Google's tiny Chromecast media player may make it to Australia, in partnership with Telstra. Apparently Telstra is also looking at building the Chromecast streaming features into its own T-Box PVR and media player. So Alex, we've recently seen the launch of iTunes Radio here in Australia. Why don't you give us a rundown on what it actually is?
Well, okay, iTunes Radio is, in essence, yet another music streaming service. Obviously, being iTunes, it's Apple, it's free in an ad-supported format, or if you're already an iTunes Match subscriber, then you get it ad-free, and it also plumbs the depths of your iTunes library to suggest other radio stations or feeds for you. If you're going for the ad-free version, I should say, you can still pick and choose radio stations, but every once in a while it'll tell you about how wonderful McDonald's or American Express actually are.
Yeah.
That's it in a nutshell. I mean, it is just yet another service, but it's got that all-important Apple branding to it. Now, you've, I think, been having a bit of a play with it. What are your early thoughts?
Yeah, I had a play with it and I'm a little bit underwhelmed, but it kind of depends what it is that you're looking for, I think. I kind of thought that it was very much a personalised service, so I could go in there, name a few bands, name a few songs, and it would really give me a lot of stuff that fitted with that. It doesn't really do that though. If I go in and tell it I want to listen to the Rolling Stones, it gives me a lot of other bands that might have been around at the same time but don't necessarily sound like the sound I'm after. Even if I narrow it down and say, alright, I want to listen to Little Red Rooster by the Rolling Stones, which is very clearly a blues song, iTunes Match just seems to go, oh, you like the Rolling Stones, here's a whole of a lot of bands that sound a little bit like the Rolling Stones, or maybe, you know, we'll cross paths once, you know what I mean?
This kind of music intelligence stuff is tricky. If you talk to the people at Pandora, they talk about their music genome, they've detected, you know, if person X likes Little Red Rooster, then they probably like this, and if they like that, then they probably like this. I wouldn't put it past Apple to be tracking and checking and clicking all of that stuff. Are you an iTunes Match subscriber?
No, I'm not, so I've got to listen to the ads, but they're only little short 15-second ads so far.
It's not so much the ads there that I'm thinking of, and look, I'll be honest, I'm not an iTunes Match subscriber either, and I have heard complaints from people saying that even if you are, sometimes the ads seem to creep their way in. No, the reason I bring that up is because in theory it's meant to then look at your iTunes library as it is.
Oh, okay.
And perhaps it's going to gain more intelligence there. It may be one of those products, bearing in mind that we're only the second market after the US where it's actually launched at all. It may be one of those products that does improve after a while, but yeah, I agree with you. It's not terrible. I haven't heard anything yet that I've gone, my God, that's hideous, but it's certainly not as smart as you might think it would be.
I found I got much better results from Pandora. If I went to Pandora and said Little Red Rooster by the Rolling Stones, I then got a lot of other really good blues artists, some who I'll admit I've never heard of, but songs that really were in the same vein as that song. And from iTunes Match, it was just like, oh, you mean the Rolling Stones. It didn't seem to really care what kind of song it was. Now, of course, the other big challenge that Apple has here is that they're last to market. Like I said, I'm playing with Spotify, I'm playing with Audio, I'm playing with Pandora, all other things. Do you think that's much of a problem for Apple, being Apple, to come in last?
Not necessarily. I mean, let's face it, Apple has done this plenty of times.
Yeah.
They didn't do the first MP3 player.
Really?
They didn't.
I thought they did.
They didn't do the first smartphone. They didn't do the first tablet.
Say
but
it's
by
not
God,
true.
they've made a
Say
lot of
it's
money
not
out of
true.
these things.
Yes, they have.
I'm sorry to break your heart so cruelly, Adam, but it is the way it is. And Apple's marketing machine is pretty fierce.
Yes.
They've also got this kind of embedded benefit that if you are using an iOS device, and this is strictly something that really is drilled into the Apple ecosystem, you won't see iTunes Radio on an Android device anytime soon, I'm confident to say. But if you're there, the moment you launch the music app, and as soon as they'd actually announced it in Australia, this was the case. If you fresh launched the music app and you had location services enabled, it went, hey, we've got this radio product, have a look at it. It's the same kind of thing that allowed Microsoft, way back in the web browser war days, to get tons of people using IE because it was already there.
Yeah.
They'll get a little bit of a market there. It's also, in some ways, it's a bit of a win-win, even if they don't get a huge market share, because while you're listening to it, there's this big button that says, hey, buy, and if you're going to buy it, you're going to buy it from them. Bingo, they've made their 30%. Plus, if you're not spending money on iTunes Match, then they're selling advertising to people, and on day one they've got ads running. They're not just advertising Apple services, they're advertising for big name brands who presumably have given them big sacks full of money for the privilege.
I would think that Apple will be taking new customers, though, more than winning customers away from something like Audio or Spotify or Pandora. If you're really wedded to one of those services and you've spent a bit of time customizing it to your taste, I think you'll be a little bit underwhelmed when you first try iTunes Radio. So I can't see people flocking from those other services, but people who've never dabbled in something like this before will go, wow.
I think there is a big difference there, though.
Yeah.
There's a big difference in that, especially if you're using something like Spotify or JB Hi-Fi Now or any of those kind of monthly premium subscription services, you've got an awful lot more kind of selection and choice. iTunes Radio is much, much more akin to Pandora
or Last FM or something like
that.
Yeah.
It's a radio service. You're handing over that curation to someone else, and that has its benefits. You can discover music, and of course you can just be a bit mentally lazy and kind of go, I just kind of feel in a bluesy mood, or make it happen, and don't bother me with playlist creation. It's that kind of product. If you're already paying someone a certain number of dollars a month and you've set up, hey, I want all these albums and all these albums and all these albums, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to jump ship. But that's not the market they're targeting, because let's face it, Apple's already made billions of dollars out of selling and largely redefining the music market.
Yeah.
Love them or hate them, they did that.
So that's the big thing here now, that Apple's always had that thing between should you buy music or should you subscribe to music. What's your preference, Alex? Would you rather be handing over your $10 a month or handing over your $20 for an album or whatever?
Look, I've got to admit, for a tech guy, I'm pretty old school in this regard. I kind of like buying music. I don't mind subscription services, and in some ways, something like a Pandora or an iTunes Radio actually suits me in a discovery sense. I can kind of pick the odd thing here or there that I like. But I have somewhat fixed tastes. I've probably got maybe a dozen to 20 artists that I'm going to want to listen to a lot. And by and large, I like the idea, I'll buy the album. I'll buy the whole album and it's mine. And where I can, especially with the way Australian law works, if I buy the CD, I can rip it, and I can rip it endlessly for my own personal use. They can't take that away from me. Whereas, as we discussed actually in the last episode, with a lot of digital files and music, in a lot of cases is no different. You buy the digital file, you don't necessarily have that.
Yeah.
And with the subscription services, of course, you've only got access to all this music for as long as you pay your subscription fee. As soon as you stop paying, it's gone.
Yeah.
I think most people recognise that, they kind of understand it, but that doesn't massively appeal to me. That no one has yet put forward a monthly subscription service that's really kind of grabbed me and said, yeah, that's great, that's got everything I want to listen to, and the price is right, and the ownership is right.
Yeah, see,
but that's
I pay
me.
about $13 a month for audio, and I've been doing that for a year or two, and I'm pretty happy with it. But I still buy a bit of music as well. I'd say I definitely buy less albums now than I did before, but for me, it's not an either or thing. It's a little bit of both. What I use audio for a lot is exploring the back catalogues. I like the Rolling Stones, and so I'm going back and I'm listening to Let It Bleed and Exile on Main Street and stuff like that I haven't bought. And then there's other stuff, I'm into B.B. King and Albert King and Buddy Guy and stuff like that. So that's what I tend to use audio for, more exploring the back catalogues, and then there is a bit of music discovery in there as well. So to me, that kind of complements the albums that I buy, but I'm definitely buying less albums than I was before, which is probably a bit of a slip, because I've also been that kind of old school guy of, oh no, I've got to own it and hold the physical copy in my hand. I'm still a bit that way with movies. I'll rent movies online, but I won't buy them online. I want the disc. But with music, I've kind of seemed to have let it slide. I think for the money and the convenience, it's just about right for me.
I've got to admit, whilst I'll buy a CD if I can because of the aforementioned legal thing, I rip them and they go into a specific storage cupboard, and generally they don't come back out again because I've ripped them, because I've gone to a digital file anyway. So I know where you're coming from. And I mean, I think ultimately it's fine. You know, iTunes Radio is fine. It's another choice out there. And Adam, we've both been having a bit of a trial of the Fetch TV PVR service. What's the basic rundown?
Well, Fetch TV is pretty interesting in that it's a fully fledged PVR, personal video recorder, in that it can record live digital television. It's got 3 tuners in it, so it can record 2 shows at once, plus let you watch any other third channel. But the interesting thing about Fetch TV is that it also lets you watch subscription channels. It's an IPTV box, and it has a couple of Foxtel, about 30 pay TV channels. Some of them you'll find on Foxtel. They're not all the most exciting ones. I think it's got TV hits, whatever it is that used to be TV1, a little bit of sport, a little bit of doco. So it's kind of, in some ways, it's your poor man's Foxtel IQ2, but it's, you know, $25-30 a month for this full box rather than the IQ2, which by the time you pay your Foxtel subscription and everything else, you'll be looking at least $80-90 to have an IQ2 in your lounge room. So if you kind of want a taste of that without the full service and the full cost, it might be the sort of box that you're looking for.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's an interesting proposition on a whole bunch of fronts. I've got to admit, I'm not massively sold on its actual pay TV offerings.
Yeah.
Whilst there's plenty to complain about, I think, with Foxtel across a whole, you know, range of issues, the reality there is that they have this incredibly broad swathe that you can access in all sorts of ways. It's not just an IQ2. You could just get their IPTV service, or you can access it through certain games consoles and TV types and things like that. Fetch TV is tied down very much more to this single box and a handful of ISPs. And
that's the other thing I should have said. You can only buy one if your ISP supports it, and there's only half a dozen ISPs that do.
Yeah. Well, it's an important consideration in there. And there's, I mean, they do some interesting stuff. I like the idea that you have the rotating movie carousel of free movies.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, some of them are a little bit hoary, a little bit old. Some of them are a little bit old,
a nice
a little bit
mix
classic
though, so
too.
you can probably find something in there that you want. There's some new ones and some old ones, yeah.
At the same time, there's some aspects that I know I've found frustrating that you haven't. Things like remote streaming to a device, which in theory it supports. I've had a lot of trouble getting that one working though.
Yeah, see, that worked fine for me, but there's always a thing with these PVRs. With complexity comes problems, basically. And this is, to be honest, more reliable than some of the things I've looked like. Some of the top fields in the Beyondwiz get rather flaky sometimes when you come to advanced features. This box is pretty good, but something really advanced like the streaming, I've tried the streaming features on the Strong box, and that was very hit and miss. For me, I found the Fetch TV box to be a lot better for that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're both in agreement that its EPG is really very good. That's
what it's all about. If you've got a recorder that's relying on the EPG that's broadcast in the signal, it's useless. It's not accurate. They don't get the TV names right. It's never going to work for you. Even if your recorder says, oh, but I've got my own fancy series recording features. If it's relying on the EPG and the broadcast signal to do that, it's going to be useless. Which means you've got to pay for something like a TiVo or a Fetch TV or an IQ2 or something that supports ICE TV, where you get someone else to actually run their eye over the EPG, and you go, you know what, all those shows are the same show, so I'll make sure I'll record them all. It's the only way to get it to work.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Fetch is in an interesting position. I've still got a TiVo sitting under my TV as well.
Yeah, so have I. Yeah.
And in all honesty, I would actually say it is still a slightly better PVR overall. Its EPG is a little bit more intelligent. You can do actor stuff and things like that. But having said that, there's no doubting, as a product, TiVo is dead in the water in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
It's just, I'm somewhat amazed the EPG still works. But Fetch has this opportunity, in a sense, to kind of come in and grab some of that for the people who don't want Foxtel for whatever reason.
Yeah. Well, if you're a TiVo user and you're thinking, so it's going to fall off the perch eventually, I've got to replace it, pretty much the two things I've seen that are most likely to appeal to you are either a Fetch TV box or an IQ2 box. And it's got nothing to do with the pay TV features. It's just to do with the core PVR intelligence and the way it works with the EPG. It's most likely to do as good a job as the TiVo did. Or those two boxes are.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, if I'm nitpicking, the remote isn't great, but then I was thinking about that. In one sense, actually, I would struggle to think of a PVR remote that I did think was great.
Yeah.
They're all kind of a bit ordinary, but hopefully you're watching something that's long enough that you don't really need to sit there and hit more than about 4 or 5 buttons anyway. Of
course, the big thing also that Foxtel, I think, will be bringing out their IQ3 soon, which has a lot more IPTV features in it. So that's really going to give Fetch TV a run for their money.
And now we've run the race of another episode of Vertical Hold. The fascinator's fallen off my hat, and I've torn up all my betting slips.
I'm off to see my bookie, and we'll see you again soon.